Now then, we are now going to go into our session 2 on trauma and resilience. And we are going to begin with a story by Tim Collins about his personal experience of climate trauma, the message he received about rediscovery, and the essential role of community storytelling and collective meaning making. Tim is interviewed by Sally as part of this video. His presentation is a video presentation that's been pre-recorded. And following Tim's video, we'll hear responses from Steffi Bednarek on collective trauma and post-traumatic growth, from Jamie Bird on his social action approach to art therapy, and from Daniela Fernandez-Catherall on therapeutic work in the community. So we're going to post a YouTube link to the video in the chat. So if you have problems viewing the video on Zoom, you can actually just watch it direct on YouTube by clicking that link there. So I'll hand over now to Kate, and we'll play the presentation.
I'd like to begin today with an acknowledgement of country, paying my deepest respects to the Wurundjeri people whose land we stand on today, right on the boundary between Dharawal and Yuin nations. I'd like to express my gratitude for the custodianship that you've so long held and never ceded over this place, and for the wisdom of land, sky, and water that you have maintained for so many generations and is so greatly needed in this time here today.
Thank you, Tim. And we're here today because you have a story to tell us. And this story is a personal story, but it's also a story with tremendous resonance for us today in community. It has elements around it of climate trauma, and it is a very stirring story. I've heard it on screen, now I'm going to hear it in bush, in place. And I'd like to start just by inviting you to think at home about maintaining safety, because this is an intense story and some people may find there is triggering moments in it, and that we need anchors when we hear stories of trauma, as we must hear them. So for us today, we're going to look around and notice the green. And that's going to be our anchors, the green of this bush, the regrowth coming up through the burnt branches. I invite you at home, look around your room and see what green there is there. It might be an object in paintings or whatever, and just make one of those places a bit of an anchor for you to return your attention to, should you need it, and also to be aware of the sounds in your environment, just as we're here of the insects and the flies.
So I invite you now to come with us, having paid attention and found your own way to navigate what Sally has suggested, and we can share these stories with you. As a young man, I journeyed to a faraway land in search of adventure. And adventure is exactly what I found, wandering into the desert with a couple of Indigenous peers, guys of similar age as my guides, and I began sandboarding down enormous dunes, experiencing home-baked meals and being welcomed in to community and home, and very much experiencing the kindness of strangers. How that experience evolved was into a very unexpected lesson that I was not ready to receive. A few days into this grand adventure, conditions shifted remarkably and radically. And what occurred first was really a revelation, both to me and my guides, that in this driest of environments, there can come rain. They, in their early 20s, had never experienced rain of this strength before. And initially, it was a delight. They became almost childlike, playful. And the environment itself responded. As the dusty, dry surface layer was washed away, as the rain built up over the minutes and hours, what was revealed was a colour scheme far more varied than this one. and even more saturated, vibrant oranges, dark greens and greys, and this complex strataing of the dunes that essentially revealed a landscape that looked like it was carved out of marble. But that most joyous of revelations was in stark and marked contrast to what followed later the very same evening. This shift from vivid colour and playful jollity into darkness and despair. The rain persisted, but we did not with our plan, and we hiked hard, returned to our vehicle, and began the journey back to the township where my guides' families resided and where they had spent their entire lives. On the drive back, a hailstorm smashed the roof, the windshield, and we were reduced to walking alongside the vehicle as we proceeded at a snail's pace back into town. By the time we arrived, darkness had fallen, and with it, a cataclysmic experience. As we crested one of the hills that sat either side of the township, we looked down at what was a surging torrent of water running from the faraway landscape of mountains and surging right through the middle of this vibrant community. We took the vehicle as far in as we could before the throngs of people doing whatever they could to try and intervene, rescue, salvage, stopped our vehicle, and we joined the throng. Nothing could be done. The waters had come very rapidly, as they tend to, and in this part of the world, there's no early warning. So we were reduced to near total impotent. 3 young men desperately trying to do whatever we could, but all we could do was sit on the crumpled bonnet of our Land Cruiser and watch as homes, businesses, and lives were lost to this ecological disaster. The memory which is seared viscerally into my mind was looking out and in the headlights of our vehicles and others, watching as a family of 3 generations calmly sat on the tin roof of their home as the waters rose and the walls melted and they disappeared into those surging, turgid waters. The night passed and the dawn of the next day revealed really a completely shifted terrain. The town was gutted. Very little, if anything, remained structurally in the pathway of the flood, which had now receded to around knee-high. We waded out, along with the majority of the community, trying to see what, if anything, could be recovered. My guides, walking side by side with me, walked softly and lightly, none of us knowing what each footfall might bring. We reached the other side without having either made a rescue or suffered any injury. They both took off up the hill to their family homes, where fortunately no one in their family had come into harm's way. And I found myself sitting alone beside an old man who was similarly by himself. We entered into a conversation in a common shared language, and all of his questions toward me were of concern for my well-being and of inquiry as to what I thought about what we had both experienced in the previous evening's events. After a short while, he stood and beckoned me to follow him, and he walked off to a building just a dozen or so meters away. He opened the door and he beckoned me again to follow him. As I approached the doorway, I could see that this was a shop. This was his shop. He was an antiques dealer. And I confess that my first response was one of hesitation and discomfort, that at this moment, the last thing I wanted to buy was a trinket, a reminder. I would happily have given this man anything that I had. I had given all of my money away that I had on my person the previous evening. So when I said to him, "I'm sorry, but I'm not here to buy anything, he stopped, turned to me, paused, and said, "You're not here to purchase, you're here to receive. And here is something that I would like to give to you." And he bent down to a table, he picked this up, and he held it out to me. And he said, "I give this to you, and I invite you to wear it so that you will remember what you have seen, and you will know what to do." He then ushered me to the door, closed it, and I never saw him again. The next day, having spent a night in the home of one of my guides, I took a bus away from the devastation. I returned to the capital city, and I did not stop. I did not pause. I did not hear this call. I did nothing. I got on a plane, I went back to my life, and I carried on. Nothing shifted, nothing was different. My being remained the same. Many years later, as an older man, not too far from where I tell this story now, another very different, but in some way paired experience brought me a different kind of change. On January the 4th, 2020, my home, my neighborhood, my community sat in the path of the Currowan fire, one of many that was active throughout the Black Summer bushfires in Australia. And this devastation zone is a very tiny fragment of the land that single fire devastated. We were in the midst of our second evacuation, the second of third within 10 days. And in one of the final acts before we fled our home, I was on the roof, on the ridgeline, with this somewhat pathetic plastic drip hose, trying to figure out how to wedge it up on the peak of the roof so that the little feeble flow would descend down either side. I was crouched down on the ridgeline with 2 half bricks in my hand, trying to prop them over this hose so that it wouldn't slip. And all of a sudden, something shifted. And I moved from a crouch to an upright position. And as I ascended, I entered a different space. And there was a shift in my consciousness. Aside from my sight, all of my other senses were nulled. There was no sound, there was no feeling of heat or of wind on my skin. But what I saw was a complete blanket of flame. And as I turned 240 degrees, everything that I saw was on fire. Not in the dark, fierce force of a bushfire. There was no choking smoke. What I saw was a Hollywood-esque depiction with vibrant shooting flames 60 feet up in the air with the tinge of blue around those dancing flames. This vision stayed with me as I received a message. I did not hear a voice. No one spoke to me. But the words I received were excruciatingly precise and ultra poignant. From what is coming, there is nowhere to hide. All you can do with all that you are is everything you can. The moment passed. The flames I had envisioned receded. I came back to my present self, I put my bricks down. I retreated from the roof. And from the moment my feet hit the floor, I was different. My being had changed. And this call I heard. And from that moment on, as I've processed and intuited and shared and evolved these two events separated by years and long distances have intertwined. And the intersection of them, I have come to realize, is one of appreciation for my role and the role that we all can choose to play in hearing these moments of calling from our lives. Thank you for your time and attention. I'll speak now with Sally, and we'll unpack this a little bit more.
So listening this time, yes, I could really feel your groundedness and your strength. And I felt the strength of being here surrounded by these trees. And I'm thinking about the movement for you from being in a very personal place with obvious trauma, and I've noticed the trauma felt less in you this time in the telling, and moving it more into a collective story. A story which relates to many people and probably many more to come. And how you've worked that through those different layers. How essential has it been for you to tell the story in community?
Well, I think essential is the word, because the story essentially was, kind of disempowered and disembodied by the dislocation that I felt from it. And it's really only been brought to any purpose at all by being shared and evolved, and most particularly, and where that evolution has been so swift, has been since it was shared with others in the community here, some of whom lost homes, in that very same fire. What I imagined they experienced, and I've been so conscious of, again, what's mine to do in sharing this story, but the sharing of it has been very much welcomed, and people have felt a release. I've been thanked by people who've lost their homes that they don't feel at this point in time able to share their story, or the connection for them is with this one incident. And I think what's really interesting now is what seems to be building, and the invitation to sort of explore this whole approach to community cohesion and resilience that can come through really any kind of creative expression of experience in a story.
And I know that you're now looking at taking this experience on with others who are also there at the first storytelling, an artist and a poet, to work with some sort of community storytelling, social enterprise.
Yeah.
So what is it, the message is all you can do with all that you have. Can you talk a bit to what is emerging with that as you collaborate with other artists in community?
Yeah, I mean, I think as much as I can speak to it now, I think there's a long road to go, and let's have this conversation again in 1, 3, 7 years and see where it's taken us all. But I think that the most poignant part of that message is everyone has a role, but the role isn't one of some sort of like wrenching shift, to do the kind of classic road to Damascus and leave everything behind and go on a redefined, renewed path, right? This isn't a rebirth, it's more of a rediscovering, right? Kind of a coming back to what is most vital, what is most necessary. And it's almost a kind of a strengths-based approach, right? Sort of take all that you are, take everything that you've done, everything that you've seen, everything that you know how to do, and then apply it to this. Okay, maybe I can tell a story. The two women that I'm partnering with, one of them is a painter and the other one is a poet. So, what's the role of a poet in addressing the climate movement, or trying to engage in climate action? Well, it's both speaking, with the poignancy and precision of a poet to these extremely complex systemic events, but it's also equipping and enabling others to put their words and voice to their own experience. And Bonnie, as a painter, is doing lots of incredible things, but one in particular was this journey that she took one of the communities here, Cabago, that's experienced some of the most horrific impact, and taking them on this layering journey of producing, each member of the community that wanted to be involved, producing 3 paintings, layering them, and then stripping back the layer of the worst of the horror, and then stripping back the layer of where they are right now, and then revealing and really kind of nesting with the vision of the hopeful future that they each individually and then collectively hold. And I think as a piece of work, that's an incredibly powerful example, and it's just one example of one expression and one mode by which any and all means people can come together and find that flame of hope.
But it is, for me, particularly essential because it is collective meaning making, and it's collective grieving and processing of trauma. And I feel very moved when I think of the seeds of this back there in the desert and that great deluge. I've been aware as we've stood here that wind has come through at several moments when we've talked. And of course the Indigenous thing is when the wind comes, this is a moment to pay attention.
So that was I've watched this presentation a few times now, and I find it a really powerful and moving contribution there from Tim. And I just want to pick out a few things that kind of really stand out for me in that. One is what Tim was saying about not being ready to hear. This isn't something that can be forced, and in his story, it was something that kind of happened spontaneously when he was in another situation of crisis. Also about the role of community storytelling in processing trauma, and how traumatic experiences can be transformational and a catalyst for personal and collective growth. And this links for me into what will be coming up in session 4, and this idea that the suffering that we can feel at the destruction of the natural world can be a type of necessary suffering. And this is something that Steffi Bednarek has written about, if you've read the paper that we posted onto the website. And this kind of transformational process that can happen is, Tim referred to, this is a different him now. How trauma can be a catalyst for growth. So I am now going to hand over to Steffi and Jamie and Daniela, who will each respond to Tim's video from their own particular perspectives, and then they'll open it up into a wider discussion. So looks like Steffi's going first.
You're muted at the moment.
Whilst we try and figure out what's going on with Steffi, can Daniela or Jamie, can you just speak so we can check that we can hear from you okay?
Yeah, can you hear that? Okay.
Yeah, you're fine. Yeah, and Daniela?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we certainly can.
Okay. Jamie, would that be okay maybe if I go first?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Go on then.
We had a little plan. It would be
Yeah.
Steffi and I and Jamie. Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank you, Tim, for sharing this very powerful story with us and the journey that you've been through from that personal experience to actually thinking about that collectively and how that drove you to action. I'm going to be very brief here, talking about our experience of the Cambridge Climate Therapists, which is a very small group of volunteers, but richly diverse and richly in experience and training in psychological interventions, therapies, if you like. And we have been hearing stories about climate trauma and climate distress. As part of forming our group, we had to make space to hear our own stories of climate distress and trauma. We have a family from around the globe, and we hear stories similar to yours frequently. But I think on our practice, that we do a lot of things in our local community. One of the things we do is we support our local activist groups, and we hear stories of the trauma of the activism and the actions, direct actions, and stories of aggressive confrontations with members of the public, and stories of arrests and imprisonment. And one of the things that we found our role in our community was to create a safe space for people to come together and share those stories, and to try to heal collectively and use those stories to empower each other. But also another thing we do, and I think that links with the history of our group, is that we run workshops in communication. Those workshop in communications were developed by Ro Rendo as part of her Carbon Conversation project. And one of the workshops is about telling your story about climate. And it's a very nice workshop in which I have experienced myself and my colleagues have experienced themselves, and we promote to others as well. That is about organizing the story of oneself and being able to come together in a group and share that, to develop a story of us together, and how that story of us would lead then to a story of now, of some sort of action. And I find that story, the power of this, sharing this collective story is not only healing. Like, don't think that therapeutic healing or therapeutic strengthening is the ultimate goal of it. The ultimate goal of it is social action. This is based on the narrative theories of Marshall Gans and how they both come together. And similar to your experience of climate awakening and how that changed your life and drive you to what you do now, I think we all have been there. And for us, it's important for the people, when they're ready, to want to access that, to be able to facilitate that process. And I probably talk so much now, and I'm going to stop. But I can see that Steffi is not here anymore.
Yeah, we're just trying to see if we can sort out what's going on with her audio.
Okay.
So yeah, if you're happy to continue, Jamie.
Yeah, so can I just say, I don't know what happened, because I was asked to leave and come back, and I can see myself. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
But you can't see me. So now it's the opposite. My video.
I can see you very small, Steffi, up there.
Oh, yeah.
But I can hear you very clearly.
She needs spotlighting, that's all.
And your name is different.
What is your...
Oh, okay.
You could rename yourself, Steffi, and then we can... there you are.
Okay.
Lovely.
So let me rename.
Do you want to go next then, Steffi?
Sorry, yeah, well,
yeah,
I don't mind. What?
Yeah, go on, and you go for it.
Okay, okay. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about collective trauma and what I find. Well, first of all, I want to say that there's so much in Tim's story. We could probably take a whole day just to pull out strands from Tim's story. And instead of talking about the theory of collective trauma, I think that the collective story manifests in us. So I'm going to talk about my own response in this, rather than theory and facts and figures. And one of the things that Tim's story has highlighted is the vulnerability of the world that we build with so much technical genius, and how quickly it can just be eradicated by natural forces, and how fragile we are. And how we defend, and Tim did this really well to highlight how we defend against this fragility with compartmentalization. And that's really what I want to talk about, because compartmentalization and fragmentation are not individual stories, they're collective response to collective trauma. And I really want to invite you just very briefly to a short journey of how the story of the world safely out there needs to become our story, and how the story of the global south also needs to become the story of all of us. And when I watched Tim's video for the very first time in preparation for today, what I noticed in myself was an absence rather than a presence. So I noticed how and I'm a trauma therapist, and how I kept Tim's story out safely out there, and how I watched and listened as a bystander. Don't get me wrong, I did feel impacted, but much more intellectually rather than in a felt sense. And there's a multiplicity of factors that kind of invited me to do that. Australia is a very long way away from the UK. I didn't recognize the landscape in which they were standing. The smells and sounds of that landscape are not familiar to me. And I guess we're all part in creating a culture in which Tim feels like he has to find a calm and composed way of telling the story. So all of that kind of invites me and lets me off the hook. But of course, there's also the fact that it may just simply be too disturbing to let this experience enter and really derange me. And the definition of trauma across the literature is an overwhelming experience with insufficient support to integrate the experience. And that last bit is really important. So I may not be resourced enough to invite the level of trauma that was presented into my psyche. And who is? So the question for me that's really important is what supports us? What supports people, but what supports me as a person and us as a community to step out of the bystander and observer role? And we're consistently pummeled with horrendous disaster scenarios. And in the absence of communal structures that offer containment and support in presenting and processing the wounds of the world, I believe we have no choice but to learn how to distance ourselves and to shut down. We just can't let it in if we don't have the support. And so the part of me, and forgive me for dragging you all into this as well, I believe the part in us that knows how to keep the suffering of others at a really safe distance is the ground that we all share with the executives in the fossil fuel industry who know about ecological devastation and who possibly personally really care about their patch of land, their garden, their biodiversity outside their door, but who, as soon as they turn up for work, are able to compartmentalize, doing their jobs and focusing on profit margins and business continuity. So compartmentalization protects us from overwhelm, but it also allows us to do horrendous things without really being impacted, and that matters. And I think we all have mastered a certain level of anesthesia in order to get by. And this is where we enter the territory of collective trauma, because trauma is fragmentation, and trauma manifests in the numb and absent and compartmentalized places of our human experience, where all the warmth and embodiment and the connection and our essential aspects had to be shut out. And that's not because we're cold or mean, but because otherwise we wouldn't be able to function in a traumatized world. And there's layer upon layer upon layer of unintegrated trauma in our, when I say our culture, I talk about the dominant Western culture. And we've inherited the legacy of what our ancestors in the Western culture suffered, but amongst all perpetrated. So how can we step into what's been perpetrated by the people we descend from and what's still being perpetrated? So all of us alive today, have been born into a fragmented world. We've become colonizers and colonized at the same time. And this normalization creates a lot of unconscious participation and a repetition in the continuous wounding of the world. And if a traumatic story is just told in terms of facts and figures, this is not received in human warmth and open hearts and really broken hearts, then the story can't land and needs to be told over and over and over again, or worse, needs to be enacted over and over again without being integrated. And so it's the balancing act between derangement, allowing ourselves to be broken open by this, and the containment of that pain, that is a necessary part in any maturation process, including the maturation of the collective culture. And I think that's where we're at. So I'll leave it there and pass over to Jamie.
Okay, thank you, Steffi. And thank you, Tim, for sharing your video again. And I'll just start with my kind of felt responses to watching it again today. Kind of really met with that sense of my shock at hearing the story, which is perhaps reflecting your own shock at the things that you've witnessed, that sense of despair, and very much picking up on that sense of kind of witnessing violence almost very close up and very immediate, and kind of what that kind of left you with, and how you've tried to manage that. And I think what I picked up more today listening to it was this metaphor of a gift, that you were provided with that gift, that you perhaps were held on, yeah, still got it, and kind of not perhaps immediately aware of what that meant. But then later on, what you seem to be saying is that how you yourself have become a gift. You feel that you've got a gift to give back to other people and to the planet, and that is in some way a calling. And that felt to be quite an intuitive understanding that you've kind of built on. And so I really picked up on that, and I thought that was quite interesting and quite moving, that you were given this gift, and then that later on kind of transformed into you providing your own gifts, and you making that call to us to use the gifts that we have been given and the time that we've been given, in a sense of calling to kind of meet this time of great need, really, to kind of help each other, really. And I think when you were talking later, what came through was the power of the arts, whether that was visual art and music, drama, dance, to help with that collective meaning making, and perhaps also collective imagination as to kind of what things might look like, what the future might be like, how might that be different. And I think that very much kind of picks up on the kind of things that I'm interested in, because I think try and work at this interface between art therapy and social justice, and an interface between therapy, research and activism. And that's come about through working with people who've been refugees, fleeing and migrating, often from political violence, sometimes economic violence. I guess more and more it'll be about escaping from environmental violence. I've also worked a lot with people who've experienced domestic abuse, and I see that more and more as this kind of fleeing from a kind of a similar process of having to flee violence. And some of that violence is very immediate, but some of that violence unfolds very slowly over time. So I've been very taken with the work of Rob Nixon, this kind of how violence unfolds really slowly and kind of creeps up on you. Yeah, some violence, it seems for you, Tim, you kind of like witnessed that really close up. But for many people, and I think we've heard some of that earlier, some of that violence can be at a distance. And I think Steffi might talk about this later, about, okay, is that, how does that link in with this idea of vicarious trauma or witnessing things from a distance? What does that leave you with? So I know when I've worked with refugees, asylum seekers, people kind of moving away from domestic violence, we've used the arts to think about, try and make sense of that process, and particularly thinking about framing it as a transitional story, you know, in terms of the past, the present and the future. And within those, there are certain features about creating a sense of escape, creating a sense of harmony, the power of relationships and support absolutely central in creating that harmony. A strong sense of agency and resistance being important for people as they move into a different kind of future. Belonging, really, really crucial, and a remaking of the self after kind of violence and trauma. And that those stories, those transitional stories, kind of go backwards and forwards in time. And I could hear that, Tim, when you get kind of how that story and those events from the past were still with you now, and how that might go forwards into the future. So I think when these kind of transitional stories, you know, I like to think of time as a lake rather than a river. It kind of circles around rather than goes. Yeah, time isn't a straight arrow, and I see that when you listen to people's storytelling. But also, what I've observed in these stories is, and I think this is the power of the arts, is because of their embodied somatic and non-verbal component, is that these stories are embodied through everyday engagement with the built and the natural environment. They are kind of very physical stories, and then they're the relational stories. So that's what I've observed when in the kind of area I've been working in, and it kind of seems to perhaps resonate with some of what you were sharing, Tim, in terms of your own story and what you're calling us to do and other people to do. So it's probably as much as I can say at the moment about that. So I think it's handing over to Daniela or Steffi. You had some questions for each other.
Yes, so I've got a question. Thank you, Jamie. I've got a question for Daniela. So you actually work with communities, and one of the things I was really interested in is so community is so much more than just bringing lots of individuals together into a room or into a group. And so in an individualized and individualistic society, can you say something about how that actually may also be difficult, how we may not really quite know or have the skills or abilities to function as a community, even if we come together as one?
Thank you, Steffi, for your question. And again, it's a type of question that's important and will take a long time. And I'm aware that our time's getting shorter now. And I would like to hear from Tim as well, feedback from our discussion. So I will briefly going to say that I completely agree. Community is not a group of individuals. I have had the experience myself of growing up and studying in the global south, in which there are different expressive emotions, and trauma is something that's shared within wider families and small communities. And the experience of working in the UK, I can definitely notice how culturally different it is. But our work in the community means that we are connecting partnership with self-identified communities by organized groups. And we have been contacted by these groups. So there's, in Cambridge in the UK, you have the student groups, you have the academic groups, you have the local people groups, you have the parents groups and things like that. And we are very aware that this community doesn't identify itself as one. But I think through our process of reflecting our roles and our biases and coming and making part of it, wanting to be part of it or acknowledge that we are part of it, we are coming out and almost literally sitting in a public bench on the high street, invite people to talk about the climate. So we are very aware that we need to also facilitate this idea of people seeing itself as part of a whole in this community. I'm going to stop for that now, but I would like to say that we use a lot of community psychology principles and on collective narrative practices to make sense of the these therapeutic interventions we're delivering, and also to help people try to connect with others. I don't know if
Daniela,
time.
did you had a question for Steffi, I think, didn't you?
I did have a question for you, Steffi. Thank you so very much for your explanation of how you heard Tim's story from the point of view of your trauma work and conceptualization. And I wonder, knowing of some of the therapeutic community interventions we are delivering and developing in Cambridge, from your talk, what would be helpful for us to bear in mind?
In terms of
creating those space for people to share their stories and help to connect their stories. I remember having a conversation with you in preparation for this, that creating the safe space is not enough.
So I think in terms of trauma work, if we want to integrate trauma, we have to be able to do two things, and they're polar opposites. We have to be able to create really solid and safe containers in which it is possible to bear strong feelings, including conflict. And at the same time as creating a really strong container, we have to be able to dissolve rigid structures. So we have to create structures, and we have to be able to let go of the structures that are no longer needed. And that for me explains why, as an individual, I can't do this on my own. I need others to do the holding, whilst I am focused on the dissolving and the letting go. So temporarily, I may need some holding by something that is larger than me. And when I talk about community, I don't just talk about the human community. I also talk about, is it possible for us to include the oak and the river and the lichen into our notion of community? And what are the rights of that community? And another point that I often feel concerned about is that community is a little bit like creating a sort of ring around a certain group of people. And often, at least in our culture, it is based on sameness, which then often bears the question, who's on the other side of that? And it invites polarization, where it's an us and them. And trauma work is all about undoing compartmentalization and polarization. And so that becomes a monoculture, or even a ghetto, talking about repetition. And so it's how can we create biodiversity in our communities, where in villages, at least the way villages used to function, we had birth and death, and we had people from different kind of political backgrounds, all belonging. They didn't have to deserve their belonging, and they couldn't lose their belonging. They were all part of it, and we had to stretch in order to kind of get by. I'm not sure we did that well, and so maybe that's our evolutionary challenge, to do that better, and to learn how to create a bigger belonging, including the more than human world. So I think that's enough for me.
Thank you. It's great. Thanks very much.
And so there's a question for Jamie as well. Jamie, could you say something about the role of art in dealing with trauma and dealing with community?
Yeah, thank you, Steffi. Well, I think what you were just saying about that, being able to create a really strong, safe space or container for kind of trying to work with trauma makes sense. Does kind of the arts can really help with that, I think, because I've kind of observed how it allows people to get some kind of distance from it and almost kind of externalize some of those thoughts, those feelings, the somatic element, especially the kind of embodied aspect of where that trauma is sitting, because I'm sure as many people here will know how trauma isn't always accessible to kind of reason or rationality or even thought. It's just somewhere in the body. And I think the kind of arts can be a useful way of kind of holding that and providing a metaphorical way. And particularly when you're working with groups as well, it does then become a collective, start to get collective meaning. People can help each other to kind of make sense of their own embodied experience almost. So I think there's this kind of real power in that. So there's the non-verbal, the unconscious, the embodied, the somatic. I think art allows us to merge the social and the political as well, because we're kind of we're surrounded by visual imageries and sounds and movement and music, and we can bring all of that and we can think about kind of how those metaphors for our lives, etc. I do really think the arts in an unrational way allow things from the margin to appear, and that includes the other than human. And I do also think it includes generations before and after us in some kind of strange way, going back to that time about the future is something that we imagine and remember. And the same with the past. I think that those things become quite blurred in a very strange way. So I think all of those are helpful.
Is it okay for me to come in and offer to Tim the last few?
Yes, yeah, because we did have a question for Tim actually, which was, what would his call to action be for us today as the audience? And
yeah, and also just Tim to just reflect on what you've heard from Daniela, Jamie, and Steffi for a few moments before we go to breakout rooms. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Nadine, and thank you all. Thank you, Daniela and Steffi and Jamie. Yeah, there's been an enormous amount from each of you. Nadine, please continue to hold the space and cut me off if I'm taking up more than a few minutes here. But I think between the three of you, you kind of cracked it. Right? I think this really is the work. There is so much potential. There is so much capability. And I think in the large majority, there's actually so much intentionality to do more, to take action, to change. What is lacking is the permission or the understanding of how and what might be possible if that convergence can come. So Steffi, I think compartmentalization, dissociative states, that's exactly it. That's how a lot of people walk around. I think, Daniela, it is absolutely the communal collective spaces where people from all walks of life can enter and starts to stitch together the tapestry of their own story. And for me, the most enlightening experiences that I had very early after the experience on the roof here was in an active hope circle using Joanna Macy's approach. And that's exactly that kind of container that you're describing. And Jamie, I think that it is an artistic movement now. Even IPCC scientists I've seen in spaces say our work here kind of can't take this any further. We need a different approach, a story-based approach. And I think one of the big advantages of the range of the arts is you can move, you can draw, you can form words into whatever construct serves your comfort, your discomfort, whatever way you want to come to this. And I think that's accessible to a lot of people of all ages and all stages of development. So I'm trying to form a summation there of what I've received. I did cry at the point that I normally do, just watching myself talk and creating that video with Sally. That's the first time that I've been able to navigate that journey without doing so. So that's an interesting thing, just to share what I've received from this, from my own felt experience. And the tension is still here. So the invitation that I would give each of you that I can see, and everybody else, the 200 it seems precisely that are here, would be just to rest with this for a little, and then ask yourself, what have you learned? What have you heard here and in your own life? And then how might you be able to explore that in your own practice yourself? And then potentially who can support you in bringing that work into your practice with your clients, or whatever your work may be. If you're a non-clinical practitioner here today, that would be my invitation. Thank you all.
That's great. Thank you so much, Tim. And thanks, Daniela, Jamie, and Steffi. I'm glad we managed to sort out your audio, Steffi. So yeah, I don't think anything more needs to be said about this session. That invitation that Tim has left us with will take us very nicely into the breakout sessions, which we're now going to go into.